Picture this. You're a Japanese tank commander in the Pacific Theater, 1944. The sun is blazing, humidity wraps around everything like a wet blanket, and you're confident that the armored beast under you, your Type 95 Hago tank, can handle whatever the Americans throw your way. Then, out of nowhere, you hear a roar in the sky, louder and deeper than anything you've heard before. It isn't the shriek of a Zero fighter, it isn't the thundering of artillery shells. It's a new sound. A massive hulk of an aircraft dives in low, bristling with firepower, and suddenly, rockets streak down from its wings, slamming into your tank with a force so violent, the armor that was supposed to protect you splits wide open like a tin can. That was the moment Japanese commanders realized something terrifying. America's P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter. It was a flying sledgehammer designed to crack tanks wide open. And the crazy part? No one saw it coming. The Japanese Army had faced American planes before, the lighter P-40 Warhawks, the nimble P-38 Lightnings, and the deadly F-6F Hellcats. But the Thunderbolt was different. It was bigger, heavier, and could carry an absurd amount of firepower. By the time it hit the Pacific in 1943, it had already earned a reputation in Europe for tearing apart German trains and convoys. But when the Allies decided to load it up with high-velocity rockets, that's when it became a nightmare. Suddenly, Japanese tanks, already under-armored compared to German panzers, were being blown apart by weapons they hadn't even imagined would come from the sky. Now, here's the wild part. The P-47 was never originally designed as a tank killer. Back in 1941, Republic Aviation's engineers just wanted a high-altitude fighter to counter German bombers. They had no idea this bulky, rugged machine would end up strafing through jungles and coral islands, carrying nearly a literal ton of bombs and rockets into battle. But necessity changes everything. As the Pacific War dragged on, commanders realized air superiority wasn't enough. They needed to smash Japanese armor and supply lines on the ground. The Thunderbolt, with its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine and rugged frame, was the perfect candidate. And when those first missions flew, Japan's high command was blindsided. Reports trickled back, tanks torn open, fuel depots turned into fireballs, artillery positions shattered in seconds. By 1945, at places like Luzon in the Philippines and Okinawa, Japanese troops described the sight of giant American planes raining fire from the sky as something out of a nightmare. One Japanese infantry diary described how the armor of our tanks melted like paper when struck by these flying torpedoes. It wasn't just destruction, it was humiliation. A nation that prided itself on its fighting spirit suddenly faced the cold reality of American industrial firepower delivered by rocket-armed Thunderbolts. So buckle in, because this isn't just another story about a World War II plane. This is about how a supposed too-heavy fighter became one of the most terrifying tank busters of the war. We'll break down how it was built, why rockets changed everything, the exact missions where Japanese commanders were caught off guard, and how this beast of the sky rewrote the playbook for future air power. The P-47 wasn't just an airplane, it was proof that when America decided to bring overwhelming firepower, it did it with style. The Thunderbolt didn't just appear out of nowhere, it was born from one of the most urgent redesigns in aviation history. In the late 1930s, Republic Aviation's chief engineer, Alexander Kartveli, was handed a problem. The U.S. Army Air Corps wanted a modern fighter that could take on the fastest German and Japanese planes. But Republic's existing design, the P-43 Lancer, was already outdated before it even rolled off the line. Kartveli's first attempt, a small, lightweight fighter, was scrapped the moment engineers realized the engines needed to fight at high altitude simply wouldn't fit in that frame. So, in 1940, he went back to the drawing board and sketched something radical, a fighter built around the largest piston engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. That engine was a monster. 18 cylinders, over 2,000 horsepower, and weighing nearly a ton by itself. The P-47 had to be built like a tank just to hold it. By the time the first prototypes flew in May 1941, pilots immediately noticed it wasn't graceful like the Spitfire or nimble like the Zero. Instead, it was huge, over 17,000 pounds when loaded, and fast in a straight line. At high altitudes, it could push past 420 miles per hour, outrunning anything Japan or Germany had in the air. But what made it different wasn't speed alone. It was toughness. Engineers gave it thick armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, so it could take punishment and still come home. One pilot joked that the Thunderbolt was a flying jug of steel, which is where it earned its nickname, the Jug. When the U.S. entered World War II after December 7, 1941, production ramped up at a pace that showed just how serious America was about air dominance. By 1942, the P-47C was flying combat missions over Europe, escorting B-17 bombers deep into enemy territory. And here's what German pilots learned the hard way. You couldn't just shoot it down easily. The Jug could absorb damage that would have shredded lighter fighters. American pilot Robert Johnson famously brought his P-47 back from France in 1943, riddled with over 200 bullet holes, leaking oil, with a canopy jammed shut, and still managed to land safely. That was the kind of resilience that made commanders trust the Thunderbolt. So how did this beast go from a high-altitude escort fighter to a tank buster? The answer lies in its sheer size and payload capacity. The Thunderbolt was the only single-engine fighter of its time that could lug 2,500 pounds of external ordnance, bombs, fuel tanks, or eventually, rockets. That meant it could dive in on ground targets and deliver the kind of destruction normally reserved for twin-engine bombers. While it was tearing up German railroads in 1943, planners in the Pacific were already eyeing it for ground attack roles. The Japanese, who designed their tanks and fortifications with the idea of fending off infantry and light artillery, were about to meet an entirely new kind of enemy, a fighter-bomber that could carry a load heavy enough to split their defenses in half. By late 1942, Republic's factories in Farmingdale, New York, were producing Thunderbolts by the hundreds, and by 1943, by the thousands. It was a machine born not just for the skies of Europe, but for the jungles and islands of the Pacific. The irony? The P-47 was considered too heavy at first, even mocked as a clumsy fighter. Yet within 2 years, it would prove to be the very thing Japan had never prepared for, an unstoppable juggernaut that could bring rockets and bombs to bear against targets thought safe from air attack. The story of how the P-47 Thunderbolt became a tank killer is almost accidental, born not from design, but from necessity. Originally, this aircraft was built to escort bombers at high altitude and shred enemy fighters with its .850 caliber Browning machine guns. 8 guns. That meant it could fire nearly 13 pounds of lead per second, more than enough to rip apart fighters or strafe infantry. But when American commanders looked at the battlefield realities of 1943 and 1944, they realized something bigger. Winning the war wasn't just about controlling the skies. It was about smashing everything the enemy relied on: trains, bridges, convoys, and yes, tanks. By then, the Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Army were already facing a new kind of war machine. Ground attack aircraft like the Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik and the German Ju-87 Stuka had shown the value of air-to-ground destruction, but the Americans wanted something tougher, faster, and more versatile. The P-47 fit the bill. It had the size to carry extra firepower, and its rugged frame could dive in low, unleash devastation, and claw its way back into the sky. At first, Thunderbolts were loaded with 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs, turning them into makeshift dive bombers. And they were effective. Railroads in France, truck columns in Italy, and even German armored vehicles fell to the Jug's heavy payloads. But bombs had a problem: accuracy. Dropping a 500-pounder from altitude onto a tank in the jungle or among coral ridges was like throwing a stone into a forest. You might hit, but you might not. Enter the next step: rockets. By 1943, the British had already tested 60-pound RP-3 rockets against German armor. American engineers picked up the idea and adapted it for the P-47. By mid-1944, Thunderbolts were being fitted with M8 and later HVAR, high-velocity aircraft rockets, under their wings. These weren't just extra weapons, they were game-changers. A single HVAR carried the explosive power of a 105mm artillery shell, and when fired in pairs or volleys, they could split tank armor wide open. Imagine being a Japanese tank crewman used to facing enemy infantry and light anti-tank guns. Suddenly, you're staring at rockets streaking down from 1,000 feet in the air, hitting with pinpoint accuracy and detonating with the force of mobile artillery. Japanese tanks like the Type 95 Heigo or the Type 97 Chiha were thinly armored compared to German panzers. Against American rockets, they didn't stand a chance. One well-placed hit could blow off a turret or ignite the fuel inside. Even near misses flipped vehicles over or left crews stunned by shockwaves. What's remarkable is how quickly the U.S. Army Air Forces embraced this evolution. Training manuals from 1944 started to teach P-47 pilots dive angles, release distances, and attack formations specifically for rocket strikes. Pilots learned that coming in at a 30 to 40 degree dive, firing at around 1,500 feet, gave them the best chance of hitting small armored targets. Some even described the experience as flying artillery. They weren't exaggerating. P-47 squadrons were effectively doing the work of entire artillery batteries, but with the flexibility to hit targets miles behind enemy lines. By late 1944, the Thunderbolt was no longer just a fighter. It was the backbone of tactical air power. In Europe, it shredded panzer divisions during the Battle of the Bulge. In the Pacific, it was being prepared for the jungle battlefields of the Philippines and Okinawa, where Japanese armor and bunkers would soon meet the full fury of rocket-armed jugs. The transformation was complete, from escort fighter to tank buster. And it was only the beginning of what the Japanese were about to experience firsthand. By the time the Thunderbolt was retasked for ground attack in the Pacific, the Japanese armored forces were already in a desperate position. Unlike Germany, which poured resources into heavier tanks like the Panther and Tiger, Japan had built its army around infantry and naval strength. Tanks were more of a supporting weapon than a central pillar of doctrine. The result? Japanese armor was lighter, faster to build, and designed for campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, places with rough terrain, poor roads, and enemies with limited anti-tank capability. Against U.S. rocket-armed fighters, though, those tanks became little more than rolling coffins. Take the Type 95 Hago, for instance. It was Japan's most common light tank in World War II. It weighed barely 7 tons and had armor no thicker than 12 millimeters in most places, basically sheet metal, compared to the 75mm shells and bazooka rounds it faced later in the war. It had a 37mm main gun, which was more than enough against Chinese forces in the late 1930s, but by 1944 it was laughably underpowered against American Shermans. Worse yet, when P-47s began firing high-velocity rockets at them, the Hago's armor could literally peel open like aluminum. Survivors reported that even near-miss rocket blasts could rupture the thin hull plates and kill crews inside from shockwaves. The Type 97 Chiha was considered Japan's medium tank, but even it was outclassed. With armor only 25 millimeters thick on the sides and a maximum of 33 on the front, it was vulnerable to nearly every Allied anti-tank weapon and completely defenseless against air-to-ground rockets. By the time U.S. forces reached the Philippines in late 1944, Japanese tank units equipped with Chihas were being annihilated from above before they even got into firing range. One after-action report from Luzon described P-47's splitting tanks open at the seams with rocket salvos, leaving burning hulks scattered across the roads. The geography of the Pacific only made things worse. Tanks that might have had a chance in open fields or broad plains were forced to fight in dense jungles, muddy paddies, or on volcanic islands with almost no room to maneuver. Roads turned into choke points. Bridges were easy to target, and every open clearing became a death trap once Allied aircraft owned the skies. Japanese commanders tried camouflaging tanks under trees or hiding them in caves, but Thunderbolt pilots quickly adapted, flying low, strafing suspicious areas, and firing rockets into any sign of movement. If a tank's engine coughed, if its tracks left a mark in the mud, chances were a P-47 would find it. By 1945, the writing was on the wall. During the Battle of Okinawa, Japanese armored counterattacks were shredded within hours by rocket-armed Thunderbolts and Corsairs. Even before American ground forces made contact, tank platoons were often destroyed from the air. In some cases, Japanese tankers refused to engage at all during daylight, choosing to hide until nightfall to avoid instant destruction. It was a psychological defeat as much as a tactical one. Where once tanks had symbolized mobility and strength, they now became liabilities, targets that drew down overwhelming Allied firepower. The harsh truth is that Japan never expected its tanks to be split open by rockets from above. Its military planners had anticipated naval battles, infantry clashes, and perhaps artillery duels, but not fighter bombers turning their armor into twisted wreckage with surgical precision. And when the P-47 entered the Pacific theater armed with rockets, it exposed the fatal weakness of Japanese strategy, underestimating just how far American air power could evolve in just a few short years. The first time Japanese tank crews truly felt the wrath of rocket-armed Thunderbolts was during the liberation of the Philippines in late 1944. After General Douglas MacArthur returned to Leyte in October, Japanese forces scrambled to mount armored counterattacks to push American infantry off the beaches. But the P-47s of the 5th Air Force were waiting. Instead of dueling Shermans head-on, Japanese Chiha medium tanks found themselves ambushed from the sky. Pilots swooped in low, loosed salvos of rockets, and turned entire columns into flaming wrecks before they could even reach the front lines. Survivors later wrote that the speed and violence of the strikes made resistance impossible. By the time tank crews spotted the jugs overhead, rockets were already exploding among them. On Luzon in early 1945, the pattern repeated. Japanese armored units moved at night to avoid detection, but come morning, any vehicle caught in the open was living on borrowed time. Pilots of the 348th Fighter Group reported that tanks could be destroyed with just 1 or 2 direct hits. Even near misses set off fuel or ammunition, flipping vehicles onto their sides. American ground troops advancing behind the Thunderbolts often described seeing rows of burned-out tanks littering the roads, many of them with hatches blown open from the sheer blast pressure of the rockets. For the infantry slogging through rice paddies and dense jungles, the P-47 wasn't just support, it was life insurance. Burma also saw its share of rocket strikes. In 1945, during the Allied push toward Rangoon, Japanese defenders tried to block British and American advances with hastily assembled armored forces. But the jungle canopy couldn't protect them forever. P-47 squadrons of the 10th Air Force flew ground attack sorties daily, seeking out any sign of movement on jungle roads. When they found it, they unleashed their HVR rockets with devastating effect. Reports from the theater note that entire tank platoons were lost in single attacks, and Japanese resistance often melted away after sustained airstrikes. Here, too, the Thunderbolt earned its reputation as flying artillery. But perhaps the most dramatic display came at Okinawa in the spring of 1945. Japanese commanders had hoped to use their armor in carefully timed counterattacks against American beachheads. Instead, the tanks never even got close. P-47s, flying from nearby captured islands, intercepted them on the move. One Marine officer later recalled watching in awe as rockets split tanks like eggshells before they could crest the ridges. By then, Japanese soldiers themselves referred to rocket-armed Thunderbolts as death from the sky. For the U.S. military, it was proof that air superiority was more than dogfights. It was the power to erase enemy armor before it became a problem. What made these first rocket strikes so shocking to Japanese commanders wasn't just the destruction. It was the speed at which it happened. Traditional anti-tank warfare required artillery setups, bazooka teams, or tank-on-tank battles. But with the P-47, a single squadron could obliterate dozens of vehicles in minutes. That shift rewrote the battlefield equation. Tanks, once the centerpiece of an army's striking power, became liabilities as soon as enemy aircraft ruled the skies. And in 1944-1945, that's exactly what the Allies did, flood the Pacific with air power that left Japanese armor hopelessly exposed. As devastating as those first rocket strikes were, the real transformation came when P-47 pilots began refining their tactics. Early missions were brutal, but sometimes wasteful. Rockets missed, salvos scattered, and pilots had to guess attack angles. But by 1945, American training had turned rocket strikes into a science. Fighter groups in both Europe and the Pacific developed methods that turned Thunderbolt squadrons into precision, tank-killing machines. It was no longer about just firing rockets in a dive. It was about knowing exactly how to fly, aim, and coordinate so that no target could escape. The technique that became most effective was the shallow dive attack. Pilots learned to begin their run at about 5,000 feet, roll into a 30-40-degree dive, and fire their rockets when the target filled the gunsight ring, usually at around 1,200 to 1,500 feet above the ground. Firing any closer risked being caught in the blast, but too high meant inaccuracy. Rockets traveled fast, but not instantly. They had to be aimed like artillery shells. Experienced pilots knew how to compensate for drop and angle, leading their shots so that rockets impacted just where they wanted. It wasn't uncommon for entire flights to hit within a 50-yard radius, saturating an enemy road or tank column with explosive firepower. Coordination made the strikes even deadlier. Thunderbolts rarely attacked alone. Squadrons worked in pairs and waves. The first pair of fighters would streak down, unleashing rockets to shock the enemy, followed by others that dropped bombs or strafed with machine guns. Japanese crews often bailed out of their tanks after the first hits, abandoning vehicles even if they weren't yet destroyed. Pilots called this walking the rockets across a target, firing one pair at the lead vehicle, another at the rear, and trapping everything in between in a fiery kill zone. Entire convoys were neutralized in minutes, tanks split open, trucks exploding, and supply wagons scattered across roads that instantly became graveyards. The psychological effect was enormous. Pilots described seeing Japanese soldiers scatter from their positions at the mere sight of thunderbolts approaching. One report from Luzon in February 1945 mentioned that enemy tank crews frequently abandoned their machines before we fired. The destruction was so reliable that U.S. ground commanders began planning operations with the expectation that P-47s would clear the path ahead. Thunderbolts weren't just support, they were integrated into the battle plan as a key form of artillery, except faster and far more flexible. Numbers prove the impact. During the Battle of the Bulge in Europe, P-47s destroyed or disabled over 600 German vehicles in just a few weeks of ground attack missions. In the Pacific, similar tactics shredded Japanese armor on Luzon and Okinawa. Japanese forces, already short on tanks, couldn't replace their losses. Every strike by Thunderbolts wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a strategic blow, bleeding the Japanese war machine dry of its few armored assets. What made all this even more terrifying for the Japanese was how routine it became for the Americans. By spring 1945, P-47 pilots treated rocket runs as second nature. For them, hitting a tank column was just another day's work. But for the Japanese on the receiving end, it was a horror show. Tanks that once symbolized power and mobility now became death traps, split wide open by the roar of rockets falling from the sky. The shock waves from these rocket strikes rippled far beyond the battlefield. Japanese officers and soldiers left behind diaries, after-action notes, and fragmented reports that showed just how unprepared they were for the kind of devastation Thunderbolts brought. In one diary from a tank crewman fighting on Luzon in early 1945, the writer described giant American planes that spit fire like dragons. He went on to say that the rockets split our tanks open as if they were made of bamboo, a humiliating comparison that captured how fragile Japanese armor suddenly seemed. Field reports echoed that disbelief. Japanese commanders had expected American tanks and artillery. They knew how to fight those, but seeing entire armored platoons reduced to burning hulks in minutes was something new. Communications from units in Burma described sky cannons that made holding ground positions impossible. By the time of Okinawa, one Japanese officer bluntly noted, "We can no longer move tanks by day. The enemy birds of iron attack without warning, and there is no defense." That statement captures the psychological defeat. Tanks weren't just destroyed, they were denied any usefulness at all. It wasn't just officers. Ordinary soldiers recorded their fear of rocket-armed planes in personal notes. A Japanese infantryman dug in near Manila wrote that whenever the Americans' big fighters appeared overhead, his unit would scatter, even if the attack wasn't aimed at them. The sound of the rockets alone was enough to send men running. Survivors of armored units told interrogators after the war that morale collapsed quickly once they realized no tank in their arsenal could withstand a direct rocket strike. Some even admitted that crews abandoned tanks at the first sign of Thunderbolts, preferring to fight on foot rather than die trapped inside what had become, in their words, iron coffins. The Japanese high command struggled to adapt. Anti-aircraft defenses were limited. Light machine guns, a few 20mm cannons, and occasionally heavier guns, but nothing that could create a real umbrella against low-flying Thunderbolts. Camouflage and dispersal helped, but rockets didn't require pinpoint accuracy to kill lightly armored tanks. Even near misses flipped vehicles, shredded tracks, or ignited fuel depots. Commanders tried moving tanks only at night, but American pilots quickly adapted, flying dawn patrols to catch vehicles out in the open. By 1945, Japanese armored warfare had essentially collapsed into paralysis, not because of lack of tanks, but because tanks could no longer be risked in daylight. The psychological gulf widened when Japanese troops compared their armor to the enemy's. American Shermans could shrug off hits from Japanese guns. Japanese tanks couldn't withstand anything heavier than rifle fire once Thunderbolts appeared overhead. This imbalance created a sense of helplessness. Diaries often described feelings of betrayal by steel, a bitter recognition that no amount of bravery could make up for the technological gap. The rockets weren't just weapons. They were symbols of overwhelming American industrial power that Japan could never match. In the end, the reaction of Japanese commanders was more resignation than strategy. They stopped expecting tanks to change the course of battles and increasingly relied on static defenses, kamikaze attacks, and infantry ambushes instead. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its rockets splitting armor wide open, had effectively erased Japanese armored warfare from the Pacific battlefield. That realization left a permanent scar in the memories of those who fought against it, and proof that air power had forever changed the balance of war. By the war's final months, the P-47 Thunderbolt had cemented itself as more than just a fighter. It was the embodiment of America's philosophy of overwhelming firepower. What began as an escort for heavy bombers ended as one of the most feared tank busters of World War II. Its rocket strikes weren't a side story. They were a preview of the future. The sight of Japanese tanks split wide open by aerial rockets was a warning to every military in the world. The age of ground dominance alone was over. Air power now ruled the battlefield. After Okinawa, with Japan's armored forces shattered and its supply convoys shredded from the sky, the legacy of the Thunderbolt was already taking shape. American planners studying the war noticed how effective rocket-armed fighters had been against tanks, bunkers, and even ships. That directly influenced post-war doctrine. The U.S. Air Force leaned heavily into the idea of fighter bombers as flying artillery. By Korea in the early 1950s, jets like the F-84 Thunderjet, ironically, a descendant of the Thunderbolt, were firing rockets at North Korean armor in almost the exact same way their piston-driven predecessors had done just a few years earlier. Even in Europe, the lessons stuck. During the Cold War, NATO strategists worried about Soviet tank divisions flooding into West Germany. Their answer wasn't just more tanks, it was air power. Aircraft armed with rockets, missiles, and precision bombs were expected to rip apart armored spearheads before they could break through. That thinking had its roots in the Pacific and European experiences of 1944-1945, when P-47 squadrons proved that fighters could stop tanks in their tracks without ever needing another tank to counter them. The Thunderbolt's legacy also lived on in how pilots remembered it. Many spoke about the satisfaction of seeing their rockets hit home, describing explosions that lifted tanks off the ground or left only blackened shells behind. They also respected the sheer toughness of the plane itself. Pilots who survived flak and machine gun fire knew they could count on the Jug to bring them back, even after hair-raising low-altitude runs. That confidence allowed them to push harder, fly lower, and deliver rockets with deadly accuracy. It was a partnership of machine and pilot that shaped victory in ways few aircraft could claim. For the Japanese, the memory was bitter. Diaries and war records described the humiliation of seeing prized armored units reduced to wreckage by a single pass of enemy planes. Tanks, once seen as instruments of strength, had become liabilities. That scar stayed in military memory long after the war ended. Japan, in its post-war rebuilding, never invested heavily in tanks again. Instead, it leaned on alliances and focused on technology, having seen firsthand how fragile armor could be when faced with modern air power. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt was never supposed to be a tank killer. It was supposed to be a high-altitude fighter, sleek and powerful. But war doesn't care about blueprints. It rewards adaptability. And the Jug, with its rockets screaming down on Japanese tanks, became a legend because it did what no one expected. It turned the battlefield upside down. It proved that tanks weren't safe, not even in the deepest jungle or the thickest cave. It showed the world that the skies weren't just for fighting other planes, they were the ultimate high ground, and from there, no army could hide.